Lessons from the Ebola cases is how thoroughly Texas protects hospitals and insurance companies. And joining me now to talk more about this is attorney Randy Johnston. And we were talking about this a little bit during the break. Wow. Tort law, as it pertains to some of these cases, is not very patient-friendly. And I'm saying that very nicely, correct?
Oh, it's not patient-friendly. It's Ebola unfriendly.
Right. And so we talked a little bit about Thomas Duncan, who unfortunately lost his fight against Ebola. And now the question becomes, is his family going to be able to file a lawsuit against the hospital, the doctors, et cetera? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, he'll have a hard time, but he can and probably should. Too many people think that a man like Mr. Duncan dies in a vacuum, but that's not true. He had people who loved him, he had people who depended on him, and his death is a tragedy, and there are people who are probably responsible for it. Two nurses get immediate health care and survive, bless their hearts. That could have been Mr. Duncan.
Sure.
So, he's got some barriers, though. Texas law is very unfriendly to patients. We love and protect our doctors and hospitals, today at the expense of the patients.
And tell me a little bit more about that. As we were talking about earlier, there are limits on the amount of money you can collect. The standard to find someone responsible is very high. Tell me about those two things.
When we start with the emergency room standard, based on a law that was passed in 2003, to prove negligence against an emergency room, emergency care, you have to prove not just that they did something no other doctor, no other hospital would have ever done. You have to prove it was willful and wanton. You have to prove basically no care at all, that they simply dismissed the man or laughed at him. And in this case, Presbyterian would defend by saying, we brought him in, we gave him antibiotics, we gave him aspirin, we treated him for fever, and sent him home. And that's something.
Sure.
And so they would say,
there's our defense.
You're right. There's our defense. You cannot get us.
Right.
The second problem he has is what's called the loss of chance doctrine. Texas rejects that doctrine, but a lot of states have it. In Texas, if Mr. Duncan was more likely to pass on as a result of Ebola than get well, then he cannot sue.
And of course, the Ebola death rate is so high. It's like 70% over there in West Africa, about 50%, which I don't think they, the numbers don't seem to line up right now because it's so new here. But that's a very difficult standard to overcome.
Well, it can be incredibly difficult. If you have a 40% chance of surviving, you want that 40% chance. And in Texas, if a hospital purposefully denies it to you, nothing you can do.
And so even if he does file the lawsuit, he manages to overcome these barriers, the chances of his family getting any recovery, what do those look like?
I don't want to be insulting to Mr. Duncan, but the sad truth of his financial situation was he was unemployed. So unlike a doctor who might get Ebola, he can't say, here's $1 million a year I'm making, and I want that $1 million into the future. So his lost wages are going to be low. What his real damages were his pain and suffering.
Sure.
He suffered horribly. Ebola is a disease where you don't even get to be hugged by your loved ones as you pass on, for heaven's sakes. That's an isolated, horrible, painful disease. And in Texas, we have said, well, that pain and suffering is worth $250,000 and no more.
And it seems like that's not a huge deterrent for hospitals, doctors, et cetera. I know they have their Hippocratic oaths and everything, but when it comes to that medical malpractice standard and knowing what's on the line is maybe about $250,000, where is the incentive there?
That's a huge problem. That's when medicine is being run by the bean counters as opposed to the nurses. And by the way, one of the biggest tragedies to come out of this is the way the hospital and CDC blamed everything on these nurses. And they are the frontline soldiers. There's nobody who cares about your care more than a nurse.
And of course, these nurses who now are free of Ebola, they can't file a lawsuit either because they're employees and they would have to claim workman's comp, correct?
That's right. They can get their medical care and they can get their daily wages for the days they miss, but they don't get any pain and suffering. They can't sue at all. They're shoved off into a workers' comp. And anyone who got the disease from them, luckily, and I'll keep my fingers crossed, so far no one has, that person can't sue anybody.
Wow.
Because in Texas, our Supreme Court has said a doctor has no duty to anyone other than the patient. So if he mistreats the patient dies, can't sue for all the reasons that we've talked about.
Right.
His family gets sick, and they can't sue.
And you know, I understand the need for tort reform when you had these gazillion-dollar awards going out to people. It was hard for doctors, hospitals to even afford malpractice insurance. But this just doesn't seem to make sense to me at all.
Well, let me say, the lawyers, the friends, and I don't do medical malpractice work myself, so, but I know the lawyers who do, and they are the Navy SEALs of trial lawyers.
Sure.
They handle these cases. They're not afraid of the fight. But there's an old saying in the law, if you let me define the argument, I can win the debate. And the argument was defined as, what do we do about high insurance premiums?
Right.
What do we do about people who got $1 million that didn't deserve it?
Right.
Instead of defining the argument as, what do we do about providing good health care to everyone?
Wow.
And the people who do deserve it, making sure they get it, in addition to making sure the ones who don't deserve it don't get it.
Wow, well, lots of great information, something I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the upcoming months. Thank you very much for your input today. We'll be back with more of the broadcast right after this.